Have you ever heard of Elizabeth Smart? It was the early hours of June 5th in 2002 when the unthinkable happened inside the Smart family's home. This was located in the nice Federal Heights neighborhood of Salt Lake City, Utah. 14-year-old Elizabeth Smart had gone to bed like any other night, sharing a room with her 9-year-old sister, Mary Catherine. Hours later, Elizabeth was jolted awake by the feeling of a cold, sharp object pressed against her throat. In the darkness, a man's voice commanded her to stay quiet or he'd kill her and her family too. Mary Catherine, who was half asleep, pretended not to notice as the figure led Elizabeth out of the room. She was terrified and she listened to the footsteps leaving, and then it was just silent. It wasn't until the morning that the Smart family realized that Elizabeth was missing, but panic spread extremely quickly. And they were thinking about it. It just didn't make any sense. Nothing inside the house was broken and her shoes were still by the bed. However, it would later be discovered that the intruder had cut through the screen in a window to get inside. Within hours, this story was on every local news station, and police launched one of the most high-profile missing person cases in history. In the early days of the investigation, suspicion mainly leaned inward. Investigations questioned the Smart family thoroughly. Richard Ricci, a former handyman who had worked in the Smart home and had a criminal record, quickly became the suspect. He was arrested on unrelated charges and held in custody for months. But then, out of nowhere, he suffered a fatal brain hemorrhage in jail before real evidence connected him to Elizabeth's disappearance. Meanwhile, Mary Catherine was absolutely filled with guilt. She was the only witness, and she kept going over this memory in her head. She was sure that she was able to help, but she couldn't remember. As months passed, public interest at the start soared, and then it slowly dwindled away. The family did everything they could, from flyers to news conferences. They even consulted a sketch artist and started focusing on another man who had briefly worked at their house, someone they had known only by his first name, Emmanuel. But the problem here was that Emmanuel was a fake name, and his real name was Brian David Mitchell. He was a homeless street preacher with a long history of religious extremism and mental illness. His wife, Wanda Barzee, was just as devoted to these twisted beliefs. Mitchell had once approached the Smart family, offering his service as a handyman. Ed Smart hired him briefly out of compassion. He felt horrible, and that was enough for Mitchell to memorize the layout of their home and Elizabeth. The morning Elizabeth was taken, Mitchell had crept in through a cut window screen, used a knife to threaten her, as I mentioned earlier, and then he quietly led her up the mountains behind the Smart home. Hours later, she stood at a camp deep inside the woods, and there, Barzee greeted her, and the nightmare truly began. They forced Elizabeth into a crude ceremony that Mitchell called a wedding. At knife point, he declared her his wife, and what followed that was months of relentless essay, psychological manipulation, and brainwashing attempts. She was often chained to a tree or kept inside a makeshift tent. Mitchell was constantly quoting his distorted religious thoughts, convincing Elizabeth that if she ever tried to escape, terrible things would happen to her and her family. As the summer turned to fall and fall turned to winter, Mitchell and Barzee moved Elizabeth around between these hidden camps, and eventually other locations as well. Sometimes, they even traveled in plain sight. Mitchell would force Elizabeth to wear a gray wig and a veil to cover her face. She was instructed to never speak, and they created bizarre cover stories in case anyone ever questioned them. On more than one occasion, police officers actually encountered them, but Mitchell's rehearsed explanations and Elizabeth's silence allowed them to slip away. Though, during one encounter inside a Salt Lake City public library, officers even questioned Elizabeth directly, but she stayed in character and said that she was Mitchell's daughter named Augustine. At one point, Mitchell and Barzee took Elizabeth all the way to San Diego County in California. They camped out among the homeless and beneath underpasses, with Mitchell believing he would find more young wives there. Back at home, Mary Catherine had a breakthrough. One night, while going over memories yet again, she remembered the voice. It sounded just like Emmanuel, so she ran to her parents and told them. With this new lead, Ed and Lois Smart pushed authorities to investigate Mitchell more seriously. They worked with a private investigator and publicized the sketch of Emmanuel. Still, months passed with no sign of Elizabeth. But finally, in March of 2003, a miracle happened. Mitchell, Barzee, and Elizabeth were spotted in Sandy, Utah, just 18 miles from her family home. They were walking down State Street in broad daylight, not far from the Southtown Mall. Elizabeth was hidden under a wig, sunglasses, and multiple layers of clothing, but something about the trio seemed off, so a couple of solid citizens tipped off the police. When officers approached, Mitchell tried to talk over Elizabeth and act like a religious zealot being harassed, but police insisted on speaking directly to the girl. At first, she said she was someone else, like she had been taught to do, but eventually, in a barely audible voice, she whispered her real name, Elizabeth Smart. She was alive. When the news broke, the whole country was in shock. After 9 horrible months of fear, Elizabeth Smart was finally going home. At first, the Smarts tried to shield her from media attention. Elizabeth herself was pretty hesitant to speak publicly. It wasn't until years later that she revealed just how much she was enduring, being subjected to repeated SA, held captive through starvation and threats, and made to participate in these bizarre religious rituals that Mitchell kept coming up with. And as for her captors, their legal battles were pretty messy. Brian David Mitchell was initially found mentally unfit for trial, but after extensive evaluations and forcible medication, he was finally prosecuted in a federal court. In 2010, a jury found him guilty of kidnapping and SA charges. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Wanda Barzee took a plea deal and testified against Mitchell. She pled guilty to both state and federal charges and served 15 years in prison before being released in 2018, a decision that Elizabeth openly criticized, warning people that Barzee still posed a danger to society.
Hey guys, Elizabeth was right. So Wanda was actually arrested last Thursday, May 1st, for violating the sexual or the sex offenders rules that are set in Utah. So she was arrested because the police were tipped off that she had visited 2 parks or playgrounds in Utah. It seems that she's already been released, but I figured I would give you a heads up, and yeah, that was an interesting development. I recorded this video like 2 weeks ago, so a little update for you guys. Anyway, back to the video.
Elizabeth didn't let her story end with just survival. She rebuilt her life. She returned to school, eventually graduating from Brigham Young University with a degree in music. She had also met her future husband, Matthew Gilmore, while serving a mission in Paris for the Latter-day Saints. They got married in 2012 and have since started a family. Even more importantly, Elizabeth became an advocate. She founded the Elizabeth Smart Foundation, dedicated to preventing crimes against children and supporting survivors. She's worked with lawmakers to shape child protection policies, and even partnered with the Department of Justice to create programs like Smart Defense to teach self-defense to young women. Despite everything she went through, Elizabeth Smart refused to let her captors define her life. That's gonna be it for today, guys. Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and if you enjoyed the video, I hope I've been able to earn a like and a subscription. Have a good night. Bye-bye.